I wanted to see her. But
What? You don't know where she is exactly? The town's landscape is your only clue?
yeah.
Hello there, welcome back to another episode of Anime with Alvin. Today we're going to be making the Tonkatsu Bento box from one of my favorite anime movies of all time, Your Name. Now in the movie, this is a typical train bento box you can find in Japan. It's called ekiben or ekibento. Kind of like a quick lunch or something that you might buy for a long bullet train ride, which can last anywhere from an hour to a couple. And the rule number one that I learned in Japan is it's always important to have something to eat with you on the train. No matter how full you are, you're always going to want it. Now these ekiben are typically not super expensive, anywhere between $6 and $10, and also aren't considered this most super gourmet thing. They've often been pre-prepared and kind of have been sitting there, but in the film, it looks absolutely delicious, just as Shinkai Makoto always makes his food look. So we made sure to get a couple while we were taking some bullet trains across Japan, and we actually got two this time. Just because both were tonkatsu and I kind of wanted to see which one was better. One of them was really dry and just didn't really have a lot of meat. It was mostly just breading and just super tough and just not good at all. But the other one was surprisingly good. It almost tastes like they made it 15 minutes before I had purchased it. The rice was still fresh and the meat was not cold and not tough and not soggy. It was actually very, very delicious. Provided the correct sustenance for this bullet train ride, and I was very happy I was able to have this experience while in Japan. And that alone inspired me to come home and want to make this. So, because it is a tonkatsu bento, the main star of the show is the tonkatsu itself, a deep-fried pork loin with panko breadcrumbs usually served with a sauce over some rice. Now, in the US, you don't really kind of get the same pork that you do in Japan. It usually comes in just the loin with all the fat removed, whereas in Japan, tonkatsu is often usually made with a cut of pork that includes not only the loin, but the fat cap and kind of like a nice little tender part of meat around it. That's what kind of everybody's favorite part is. We were unfortunately only able to get just the loin, so I will still make it work. So I'm going to take this entire pork loin and slice this into roughly 2-inch rounds, because this is going to get pounded out to help tenderize the meat a little bit. If the meat somehow has tough membranes and stuff, I like to sort of score the surface or any of the membranes to allow the meat to loosen once you start slamming it with a metal tool of your choice. Okay, once I have pounded my meat out thoroughly, now it's important to salt the meat as well. Really season that meat before we start to bread it. Just some salt. This is how flat the cutlet like to look because it's going to get a little bit bigger when it fries. So I'm going to let these kind of sit on the side until I'm ready to work with them again. Okay, now for my favorite part of making tonkatsu, the tonkatsu sauce. A lot of restaurants have their own version of this. You can also buy it, but I think a good tonkatsu really lives and dies by not only the pork quality, but the sauce. Tonkatsu sauce is a nice sweet and sour sauce that usually has some fruits and vegetables to kind of add to the flavor of the sauce itself. For our version, I'm going to cut up a carrot, a whole apple, a whole tomato, about a half of a white onion. Actually, let's just do the whole thing, why not? And some prunes, about like 5 or 6 of those. Chop those roughly because this is going to get cooked down and blended later. We're going to start with a medium saucepan, throw all those nice fruits and vegetables in there, kind of simmer that until it starts to get soft. Once that's good, I'm going to add in about 200 grams of soy sauce, 200 grams of sugar, 50 grams of rice vinegar, and about 100 grams of Worcestershire sauce. This will get adjusted to taste at the end, so it's not super important the initial quantity. This is going to simmer for about 15 to 20 minutes until it is getting nice and soft, and then we're going to take an immersion blender and blend it until it is smooth. Now I didn't mind taking any of those skins from the apples and leaving them in there because 1, it adds flavor, and 2, we're also going to strain this out through a sieve, pressing that through so that any of those hard bits that's left behind, what is remaining is a nice, delicious, somewhat thick tonkatsu sauce. If it's too sweet, add some more vinegar. If it's not Worcestershire enough, you add some more of that. This is the stage where you can adjust it to the way that you like it. Okay, on to the breadcrumbs. Now instead of just using dried panko breadcrumbs or normal Italian breadcrumbs, in Japan it's common to use fresh panko breadcrumbs or breadcrumbs made from actual bread, like shokupan. And since we can't really buy that prepackaged here, what you can do, if you go to the store, any of those Asian bakeries, you get either milk bread or shokupan, you can blitz it kind of roughly in a food processor. Not too fine though. What's the best part is if you have these little shreds of bread that kind of create these nice jagged stalactites of crusty stuff after you've been frying them. So once we blitz that, crusting in it all, you can take the crust out if you want. I just didn't want to waste food. Our milk bread snow is ready for battering it. So to get our frying station set up, I'm gonna crack about 6 eggs. I know that might seem overkill for 2 pork fillets, but we're gonna use these later, do not worry. It's gonna be a fun time today. I'm going to first sprinkle some flour over these pork chops until they're nice and dusted, making sure to pat until all the excess flour comes off. Dunk them in the egg and coat them in a nice thick coat of these fresh breadcrumbs, pressing it to make sure that as much sticks to it as possible and then letting it sit on a rack while we heat up our oil. Obviously there's a lot of leftover breadcrumbs and eggs. We're going to turn that into something fun right after this. So I'm just gonna let that sit for about 5 minutes so that any of that excess coating can adhere to the pork chop. And so while that's happening, I'm gonna thinly slice up some cabbage. Kind of helps you digest and is known to make the fattier, greasier things go down and add a nice refreshing crunch to your food. Now this is also seen in the Tonkatsu Bento box in your name. So I'm gonna hand cut this, slicing as thinly as possible to get shreds because you're gonna be eating this raw. Once that's done, we're also gonna just slice up some pickled radish that we got at the store. This thing is quite large. I think the yellow is just food coloring, but it's just a nice pickled element to eat with your fried food. So we're just gonna cut up a couple slices of that. Okay, once the oil has been heated to 350 degrees, we're gonna fry each cutlet for about 5 to 7 minutes until nice and golden brown. Once removing it, season immediately with salt and just admire those nice bits and craggly parts of the fried bread pieces that we used instead of just using normal breadcrumbs, because that would be very, very, very different in appearance. Once that rests, we're going to go ahead and assemble our bento. First, we're going to just take some rice that we cooked off to the side, not super important, put that at the bottom of our bento box, which is actually quite long, then a nice bed of our thinly sliced cabbage right on top of that. The heat from the rice should slowly cook the cabbage slightly so it's not super raw. And then we're going to slice our tonkatsu up into little thick slices, probably about 3/4 of an inch long. I tend to like them on the bigger side. And because this is quite a long box, I'm actually going to use about 1 whole cutlet and about 70% of the other cutlet to kind of fill out this box. Don't worry, those leftover pieces will be put to good use as well. Then, just like the movie, I'm going to spoon the sauce approximately over half of the cutlet, allowing the excess sauce to drip onto the cabbage and down into the rice below, which should be quite delicious. Then I'm going to garnish the top with a few just simple sliced scallions, assemble our radishes in the corner along with a pickled plum or a umeboshi, as that will also help cut down on the fattiness from our fried foods. And I present to you our version of the Tonkatsu train bento box from your name. A welcome snack, I'm sure, for any traveler going off to try and save the world from ruin, but also just a nice meal to have or to give out. All right, let's give it a try. Let's get a piece of this pork from the middle with some sauce and with some rice. And yeah, it is kind of tough. You can't really do too much about it because pork loin on its own is very lean and very tough. And usually this is kind of the thing you would want to enjoy with high quality pork chop meat, but you can't always get that, and that's totally fine because the sauce and the crust and the rice all together make up for that in its entirety. Still super delicious. I'm glad everybody in the studio got to come down and try some. And this is where things start to get fun because you do have a lot of leftover ingredients from making this, both cooked and uncooked. So I had a couple of ideas. First things first, let's take those random pieces of leftover cutlet that have just been sitting there since we didn't get to use them. Let's cut them into just little cube-like pieces, roughly chopped, and set them aside. Then I'm going to cut up the rest of our scallions that we bought for this, probably about 3 or 4 of those, and some radish that we also have left over into small cubes. All right, now let's get to some fun stuff. In a wok, I'm going to toast a little bit of butter until it is about slightly brown, and then I'm going to take the remaining breadcrumbs from the frying process and throw that in and toast them evenly until the breadcrumbs are nice and crispy. Then I'm going to remove all those breadcrumbs and pour in a little bit of oil so that we can fry up the remaining amount of beaten egg that we used in the battering process as well. There's probably about 4.5 eggs in here, so that's a good amount. I'm going to fry this up wok style, which means high heat, let it bubble up and almost turn into a pancake before breaking it up into small bits. And this is the important part when it comes to wok frying eggs for something that I'm going to be making right now, is that I like to kind of crush these up into little bits, slow frying them until all the water comes out. So you're not getting fluffy eggs, you're getting crispy fried shards of eggs, almost like crispy ground beef. This actually takes quite some time because you have to break up all those chunks and essentially watch the eggs turn into these little shard bits that start to dance from the heat of the wok, because that doesn't happen until all the water is gone, and that's when the aroma of those egg yolks start to fry and come out really deliciously. Once this is ready, I'm going to throw in some leftover cabbage that we had on the side that I also chopped up, give that a little bit of a nice coloring on it, and then I'm going to throw in those pork cutlet pieces that I cut up earlier, frying that up as well. Then to season, I'm going to add some MSG, sugar, and salt, and approximately a 1:1:2 ratio is what I've learned. And then I'm going to add in all the leftover rice that we had from the rice cooker from the bento box. This is just going to get thrown in, and if you can't guess it by now, yes, we are making fried rice. The goal here is to also break up all the large clumps so that every single grain of rice has been coated by any of the oil and the flavors from the remaining things in the pan, and it's going to start sizzling and cooking on its own. We don't want any clumps here, so I'm alternating between a moving around process with the wok ladle as well as a smashing down process to kind of break up any of those lumps and make sure that this whole entire thing, as my friend Eric calls it, who owns a Taiwanese restaurant, Lily Fleming, where each grain of rice is almost coated in oil and cooks like a steak, which is pretty delicious. So after all the rice has been broken up, we're going to finally add a couple spoonfuls of our tonkatsu sauce, because we made a lot of it. This is going to go sizzle on the edge of the wok, and then we're going to slowly incorporate it in until the sauce is nice and deliciously seared. Okay, once this is almost done, we're going to add in radishes and scallions that we cut up earlier, about 90% towards the end, and just kind of let that warm through. We don't want to cook this down or get soggy. This is just mainly trying to break the rawness of it, but also had a nice bit of bite and greenness to our dish. Okay, so I present to you some leftover katsudon fried rice, made with the leftover pork cutlet, leftover breadcrumbs, and the eggs, where the breadcrumbs are going to be nice crispy garnish and everything else just kind of gets turned into fried rice, but should be delicious because, well, how can this not be? Upon tasting it, this is in fact confirmed quite delicious. I approve. I think my friend Eric would also approve as well. Everybody that tried it also approved. So I think it's fair to say making fried rice with this kind of food is approved, if you do it right. This whole thing actually took about 30 minutes because frying the eggs and the rice to get it crispy took at least 20 to 25 minutes. Speaking of my friend Eric, one of the dishes that he serves at his restaurant 886 is stir-fried cabbage with bacon, which sounds rather interesting, but is actually way greater than the sum of its parts because he has access to really good cabbage and really good bacon. And we're just using normal store-bought cabbage and bacon because we had so much cabbage left over. I kind of wanted to make something a little bit healthier out of it. So yeah, we're gonna add bacon. First, I'm gonna cut up an entire pack of thick cut bacon. I'm gonna slice up about 4 garlic cloves very, very thinly into rounds. And then we're just gonna render all the bacon fat out into the pan just by cooking the bacon in the wok itself till it is slightly crispy. I don't want the bacon crispy all the way through. Then I'm gonna approximately drain half of that fat. Then I'm gonna throw in our garlic until it is barely starting to brown on the outsides, and then our cabbage. We just took all the leftover cabbage that we had, cut them into roughly big chunks, and just threw it in and tossed it. And make sure that each piece of cabbage is separate and is coated deliciously in bacon and garlic flavor. Once it's looking pretty good, I'm going to add in a pretty heavy dose of MSG, probably about a tablespoon or so. This stuff is delicious. And once this is almost ready to go, once again, finish with a tablespoon or so of the leftover tonkatsu sauce. Add a little bit of moisture, kind of bring everything together and add some acidity to this dish. That's it. Pretty simple. Plate it up. This is just stir-fried cabbage with bacon. Sounds simple because it is, but is somehow greater than the sum of its parts in many ways. Obviously, still very different than a restaurant version, but Eric's dish inspired me to kind of turn cabbage into something more exciting this way, and we had some bacon, and that always is something that people love. So yeah, that's what we did with the leftovers from today's shoot, and we packed home everything that we made today. There was a lot of people in the studio, and we made sure to divvy it up, not so evenly I guess, but made sure that everybody had some nice presents to take home with them and enjoy for dinner, or just immediately in the car. I don't know how people do that, but have fun.